So first of all, Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 to 3, and then it'll be Zechariah chapter 8, and then Mark chapter 4. Okay? So Genesis chapter 2, verse 1 begins and says, "And so the whole universe was completed. By the seventh day, God finished what he had been doing and stopped working. He blessed the seventh day and set it apart as a special day, because by that day he had completed his creation and stopped working. And that is how the universe was created."
And from Zechariah chapter 8, verses 1 to 8. The Lord Almighty gave this message to Zechariah. "I have longed to help Jerusalem because of my deep love for her people, a love which has made me angry with her enemies. I will return to Jerusalem, my holy city, and live there. It will be known as the faithful city, and the hill of the Lord Almighty will be called the sacred hill. Once again, old men and women, so old that they use a stick when they walk, will be sitting in the city squares, and the streets will again be full of boys and girls playing. This may seem impossible to those of the nation who are now left, but it's not impossible for me. I will rescue my people from the lands where they have been taken, and will bring them back from east and west to live in Jerusalem. They will be my people, and I will be their God, ruling over them faithfully and justly." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Last one's Mark chapter 4, verses 35 to 41. It's page 51 in the second part of the Bibles. Jesus calms a storm. On the evening of that same day, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let us go across to the other side of the lake." So they left the crowd. The disciples got into the boat which Jesus was already sitting, and they took him with them. Other boats were there too. Suddenly, a strong wind blew up, and the waves began to spill over into the boat, so that it was about to fill with water. Jesus was in the back of the boat, sleeping with his head on a pillow. The disciples woke him up and said, "Teacher, don't you care that we are about to die?" Jesus stood up and commanded the wind, "Be quiet." And he said to the waves, "Be still." The wind died down, and there was a great calm. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Why are you frightened? Have you still no faith?" But they were terribly afraid and said to one another, "Who is this man? Even the wind and the waves obey him." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Thank you, Ethel and Yoji. So what on earth links those three readings? Especially when we're thinking of Jesus is Lord. Life often seems so cluttered and full, doesn't it? So many things that we feel we ought to do, and it feels like so little time in which to do them. And it can be really hard to work out what the priorities are, and it can be just as hard to set boundaries. But God has set boundaries. And God has set boundaries for us. We said last week that God has created us to work. And equally true is the statement that God has created us to play, to rest and to play. And we need to hear that within the real busyness of life in the 21st century. We need to hear that for the sake of our health, physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. I know it wasn't there in Ecclesiastes 3, but I believe it's true. There's a time to work and there's a time to play. And both of those are beautiful in their right time. And so the first thing that I want us to consider this morning is that God has created us with that need to rest. He's created us for rest. We can't work 24/7. We can't burn the candle at both ends, as we say. Or at least we can't do it for very long before the body decides, I'm not playing this game any longer. Or before it becomes too much for us mentally. There are times when we need to follow the words of the advert that you may well remember. It said, take a break, have... Right, well, if you can remember that, some of you are looking and saying, have a what? Yeah, take a break, have a Kit Kat. Now, if we can remember that catch line, then hopefully we can remember that God has created us to take times of rest, times to play. In fact, our reading in Genesis 2 showed us that God rested. On the seventh day, God stopped working. God ceased. God took a break. And God blessed that seventh day and declared it holy, that is, set apart as a special day. Now, the Good News Bible, stopped work, or the New International Translation, God ceased from his work, is maybe better than simply talking about rest. Because rest might give the impression that we sort of sit around and do nothing. Now, there may well be moments to do exactly that. To sit in the garden with an ice cream on a summer's day and watch a beautiful sunset. Or if we don't have a garden, through the windows. But rest is to be more than just not doing anything. Rest can be much richer and much fuller than simply resting. But why did God do it? I mean, surely God hasn't run out of ideas. God hasn't become tired after all that he has created. I mean, Isaiah says, you're the everlasting God. You don't grow weary. You don't go tired. And the Psalm 121 that says God neither slumbers nor sleeps. So God doesn't doze off after lunch for an hour or sleep through the night. So why does God stop working? Why does God rest? I think simply God is setting a pattern for us. God does not need to rest. He's the everlasting God. But he has created us as human people with a need to rest. And so right at the very beginning, God is putting this rhythm into life. There's a time just to stop. There's a time to work and to be busy, but there's a time to stop, to rest. And God was teaching his people that even before the Ten Commandments, in which he speaks to them about keeping the Sabbath day special. Because before we get to Mount Sinai and the covenant, in Exodus chapter 16, God provides the manna from heaven for them. And God says to them, through the week, you collect enough for that day. Don't collect stuff for tomorrow or the next day or the day after, because if you store it up, it's going to go bad. But on the sixth day, God says, today, now you pick enough for today and for tomorrow, so that you don't have to do that work tomorrow. Tomorrow will be a day of rest. It will be a Sabbath day for you. And doesn't Jesus remind us in his teaching that we haven't been made to do something on the Sabbath, but the Sabbath has been given as a gift to us for our good, for our benefit. God has created us to rest. God puts that rhythm into not just a day, but also a week. And Jesus took rest. Took rest in order to have time to worship and to be with family and friends. There's that passage in Luke's Gospel that tells us that Jesus went to the synagogue as was his custom. And there's a reason that the Gospel writer has put it that way. He went to the synagogue, as was his custom. That means it was his habit. That's simply what Jesus did on the Sabbath day. Oh, yes, he did other things as well. He went and had lunch with Peter and Peter's mother-in-law. He healed her. People came and they talked together. But the priority for Jesus, the first thing on the Sabbath, was to be at the place for worship, for prayer, for the reading of the Scripture. And if Jesus does that, then if we're living under his lordship, then that ought to be our priority too when it comes to the Lord's Day. Time to stop the crazy busyness of the week. Time to focus our thoughts, to spend time in the presence of God. Yes, we are to know God day by day. Yes, we are to know that God is with us in all of the busyness. But the Sabbath, time to stop. Time to focus our thoughts all the more clearly. And Jesus knew the importance of not working full steam every moment of every day. Which brings us to our reading from Mark chapter 4. I mean, think about the situation that is there. Maybe we should have read one or two of the verses before about all of the ministry of Jesus, his teaching, and the people that were gathered around. The crowds are still there. The crowds still want to hear his teaching. There are some there who still want to be healed. And what does Jesus do? He says to the disciples, come on, let's get in a boat and we're out of here for a while. The need was still there. There was work still to be done. But Jesus says we need a break. We need to stop for a moment and get away. And then as they sailing on the boat together and this storm comes up, the disciples are panicking, wondering what on earth is going to happen now. And they look round for Jesus and he's gone to sleep. He's gone to sleep because he's taking that break. And he's comfortable in taking that break. He knows it's a good and a right thing to stop. But it's not just about sleep or rest. It's about time to do other things. As you read through the Gospels, look at how often Jesus is invited to go for dinner. And he goes. Look at how often Jesus is invited to go to a wedding. Look at how often he is spending time with his friends. We're told that there were women who opened their home to Jesus and his disciples. He takes time to stop, to be still, to worship, to eat, to sleep, and to be with friends. And if he does that, then don't we need it? Don't we need that time in the middle of really busy schedules some weeks just to stop? If he accepted invitations for dinners and for weddings, then shouldn't we? And go and enjoy them? Enjoy the time to sit and to talk with family and with friends? If he stops in order to be in the place for worship on the Lord's Day, then shouldn't we be doing the same? Copying him. Setting boundaries on our time, even when it's difficult. Now, when we start to talk about rest and play or recreation, I guess there are probably two dangers or two extremes that we could go to. One is that the moment we put everything down and stop and do something different, we feel guilty. You know? There's something else that we really ought to be doing. There's the final bits to the report that we've got to make at the end of the week. There's something else that needs tidying up from the mess that the children made earlier in the day. And the moment we stop and sit and we see it's still there, we feel guilty for stopping. And we mustn't do that because we need time to stop. The opposite extreme is, well, we just sit and we do nothing. So we don't take the children out to the park. We don't meet up with friends for a meal. We don't go along to home group. We don't do anything. And that's equally, in one sense, a waste of that rest time. Because rest, or that is not just about stopping and doing nothing. It's about doing something else, which in itself refreshes and reinvigorates us. You talk to those who play in our worship group and who sing. You ask them if they want to be here at 8 o'clock every Friday. And you'll tell you there are some weeks they would rather not. But they'll tell you at 9:30, there's a little bit more of a spring in their step when they go home. Because they've been doing something different. They've been doing something before the Lord. And it's been good. And so the first thing is that God calls us to take time to stop, to rest. And the second thing is that when we do that, then there are so many blessings of God to enjoy. Hinted already at the blessings of good food and friendship. I love the story that Luke gives to us in chapter 5, where Jesus is walking through the town and he sees a man called Levi, and he wants to add Levi to his group of disciples. So he says to Levi, "Come and follow me." And what's the first thing that Levi does? It seems that night he's got his colleagues together, he's put on this really lovely dinner and invited Jesus to be the guest speaker. And they enjoy food and friendship together. Why do you think Jesus was so upset when Lazarus died? You notice early on in John chapter 11, his two sisters, Mary and Martha, send this message to Jesus. The one whom you love is sick. The one whom you love. Why would they say that? Because Jesus and Lazarus were friends. And friends of Mary and Martha too. They'd eaten together. They'd talked together. They'd spent time together. And the scripture says that Mary and Martha opened their home, which suggests to me that sometimes they stayed over the night. And when we make time, when we set that boundary to break and for recreation, we can enjoy the blessing of food and friendship. But then the blessings of play. Do you like those verses from Zechariah 8? If you're able to find it quickly enough. The Lord's promise was to restore his people. And the Lord begins to illustrate that in a number of ways, but two of them that stand out. First of all, that men and women would simply be sat in the town square together. Lovely picture there. They live to old age, and so they've got their stick with them. Not that you always have to wait for old age. Some people love to take a stick when they go walking on the hills. But they sit out, and it's not a sense of danger or fear. It's a sense of just, hey, we can sit out together. And we enjoy sitting out together. And when we're out and sat together, we talk together. We're with friends. And then that lovely description of the children are there too, playing. Isn't that a lovely description of God's blessing upon his people? Reaching old age and sat with friends. And the little children gathered around and playing. And do you know what? God enjoys that. If you're a mum or a dad or a grandparent or an auntie or an uncle, how do you see times for playing with the children, the grandchildren, the nephews and the nieces? Is it a bit of a chore? Maybe sometimes it is. Or is it something to be enjoyed? I wish now I'd never ever rushed a moment of bedtime story just because football was starting at 7:45. You know, if somebody scored a goal in the first 15 minutes, you'd see it replayed at least 6 times in half time. But you can never have back that time with our children or our grandchildren or our nephews or our nieces. And it doesn't take much for play to become a habit and a part of our regular routine. And then if that is then broken at some point in the week because one of us is going out to home group, that actually is not a bad thing either. Because our children know that we love them. Our children know that we enjoy being on the floor and playing a game together. But they also know and see the importance of our faith and our growth in faith and our relationship with other Christians. But the blessing of play is not just about games. It's about meals with friends. It's about sitting and chatting. It's about going to a concert or to the theatre together. Now, I'm not trying now to list another set of things that we've got to do and fit into the program, but I want the blessing of stopping. Yes, sometimes to do nothing, but sometimes to do something that enriches our life, something different that refreshes us and revives us. And then there's the blessing of exercise and sport, and sometimes we can miss that when we read Timothy. 1 Timothy chapter 4, Paul writes and says, Timothy, exercise has some value, but godliness has value for everything. Paul's not wrong, but sometimes we miss the first bit because we concentrate on the second. There is some value in that physical exercise and in sport. There is value in that brisk walk that gets our heart pumping, or the swimming, or the game of tennis, or the slightly more gentle exercise with Young at Heart. And that exercise can affect our mood too. It can actually lift us. In the same way as reading a good book, or listening to music that maybe sometimes gets us tapping our feet, or if it's just very gentle, helps us doze off for a little while. And those things are blessings to us when we make that time. So I want to encourage us today that since there are blessings to be gained from taking a break, from recreation and play, that we set the boundaries so that we can do so. That we hear what God has to say to us on this, that it's important for our health. And at different stages of our lives, we are maybe going to have more or less time. Or we have to be creative in the way that we use that time. Or see that time doing more than one thing. So that games with the children is not a chore and another job to be done, but actually that's part of unwinding and relaxing a little bit. And a meeting with others in our home group is not another meeting to have to attend, but is part of doing something different after a busy day. Church weekend is not another impossibility to fit into the month of May, but it's actually a really good investment for us in our families and as a church family. It's doing something different that becomes a blessing to us physically and spiritually as well. So first of all, God calls us, God commands us to take a break. Secondly, God blesses us when we take a break. But thirdly, we need to trust God enough to take a break. Let me explain what I mean by that. You see, in our very, very busy 21st century world, there's the danger of feeling that if we stop, everything's going to crash down around us. Whether that be within our family or in our workplace and even within church. And we need to trust God enough to take a break. To take a break in order to find time to read the scripture and to pray. Mark chapter 1 has an interesting story of 24 hours in the life of Jesus. In the morning, he is preaching in the synagogue. There's a man there who has an evil spirit, and Jesus sets him free. After the service is finished, that's the day when he has that invitation to lunch with Peter and his mother-in-law. When he goes and arrives there, he finds that there's no food prepared because she's sick and in bed. So Jesus is asked to go and see her and heal her. And maybe through the afternoon they sit and they talk. But in the evening there are crowds that are gathered at the doorway. They're wanting Jesus to heal them. And what happens the next morning? Jesus gets up early and finds a quiet place in order to pray. Now, there's always a time to have a lie-in and breakfast in bed. That's great. But there's also time to make in order to be still and to be in the presence of God. For it's in that time that we learn to trust that He knows best. There's that psalm that rejoices, He has made us and we are His, the sheep of His pasture. And so He knows what's best. You all know that if you get a box with an appliance for your home, that when you open it up, there's a little instruction booklet. Even if you've used a kettle loads of time before, there will still be an instruction booklet in the box. And somewhere, either across the front cover or at the very end when you finish reading it, it says, follow the manufacturer's instructions. If we can do that with a kettle or a camera or a television or a microwave, doesn't it make sense to do that with our Creator? Learn to trust Him, that when we take a break, things are not going to go crashing down around us. But that means that we need to trust Him to supply every need. Now that is the challenge for us today. The cost of renting or having a mortgage in this part of London means that sometimes it's not an option for husband and wife whether one of them works and one of them is at home. One of them works to pay the rent and the other one works so that they can live. That's how it is sometimes. And yet, even in that situation, we can't work 24/7. If we try it, it will take its toll upon our health physically, mentally, and spiritually. It'll make a difference, a bad difference, in the relationship with our spouse, with our family, with friends, if we actually ever then have any, and our relationship with the Lord. And so we have to trust that the Lord will provide for us. It may not be everything that we might like. But in the words of the song from the Jungle Book, it will be the simple, bare necessities of life. And that was the lesson going back to Exodus chapter 16. How did they know that the next morning there would be more manna? They had to trust God. How did they know on day 6 that if they kept it for the next day that it wouldn't go bad? Because some of them had tried to keep it on day 1 and it had gone bad. And some of them still hadn't learned the lesson. They kept it on day 2 and morning of day 3 it had gone bad. So how did they know that on the morning of day 7 it would be fine? They had to learn to trust God. And so do we. You see, what it meant for them was later when they went into the land of Canaan, they realized that if they didn't go out into the fields one day, the harvest wasn't going to fail. They had to learn that if they didn't go and move the sheep onto pasture that day, they weren't going to die. We need to learn that if there's one day in the week that we don't go into the office, the business isn't going to collapse. We need to learn that if there's one day when we don't answer and reply to all the emails that have come in, we're not going to lose our job. If you took one of the magazines that we were giving out, particularly to people at the edge of church at Christmas time, you'll have read a story of a man called Gary Grant, who owns a chain of toy stores. And in December, his store, when stores pack their windows with the newest Christmas toys, he always keeps space for a nativity scene. And if his shop is in a shopping centre, you know which one it is. Because on Sunday, it's closed. Even if Sunday is Christmas Eve, the busiest day of the year, it's closed. Because he wants to give his staff time to have a break. He wants them to have time to worship God. He wants them to have time to be with their families. And he even did it in the recession in 2008-9. His bank manager told him one day, Gary, you're going to have to give up this Sunday stuff. He didn't. And God saw him through. Sometimes we have to trust God in order to take a break. Please don't take what we've been saying this morning as an excuse that rest is a time to do nothing at all, because actually then you miss out on the richness of what rest can be. But equally, don't feel guilty when you take time to have a break, when you take time to play, when you take time to enjoy the blessings of God in so many ways. There is a time to work. I believe there's also a time to play. And may God bless us in our playing.